while it might seem premature to talk about a team whose roster isn't even announced at this point, not even a player, there's still value in the exercise, and if the league roster that we have for them at this point actually ends up being the final roster, then we have a solid piece of analysis that has some lasting power. If not, it was a fun exercise, and for the time being, it had value in that. As such, I want to talk today about the Toronto Defiant, and the first thing we should be talking about is the things that we do know. And they are arguably the most important part of the entire team building process. Because every team starts with a staff. Now, from top to bottom, we start with head coach Bishop. Bishop, of course, known as the head coach of London Spitfire, also recently announced that he didn't step back from a position or was indeed fired, but had to step back because of personal reasons. Was before that a coach for Cloud9, and before that was a player on KDP. Now he has a long history in Overwatch, and his record is very hard to judge, as it is for the vast majority of coaches in the Overwatch League. And I personally tend to not judge coaches by how they appear on social media, but by their achievements. And there are very few who've been either around or employed long enough and by enough teams to really have some value in the data of their achievements. So I don't know how good Bishop is at this point, but my gut feeling tells me that he's one of the better coaches in the league. So then we go to Baroy. Okay, so I guess I should have made that caveat. Of course, if you followed this channel, you might have seen my video about Winston's Lab, who Baroy is basically the brain of. I'm also a friend of his, or he's a friend of mine, and I will add the caveat that I actually don't have any inside information that could at all be disclosed here. It's actually, Baroy is one of the most tight-lipped people, and while on the wayside people have told me that they worked with Baroy, it's actually quite the case that I find out about Baroy working with Overwatch League teams in the past by the Overwatch League team staff themselves, not by Baroy. He's incredibly tight-lipped in that regard. So if you were expecting any leaked inside info in this video, I have to upset you at this point. This is not going to happen. But let's talk about Baroy. So Baroy, once again, the brain behind Winston's Lab, is someone that has a mind and also an ability to see patterns in the data. And I think there, as I will hopefully make a case for, I sort of see a stamp of his thinking in this team. What I did have access to, and what I'm fortunate enough to have had access to, is the brilliant mind behind him. And I understand what he values in Overwatch and what he has empirical evidence for, which basically causes teams to be successful. I think I see some patterns here that we have talked about without bringing the players ever into the conversation. So Baroy, certainly a big asset, actually quite surprised that the team was able to lock him down. Then we have Bubbly, former player of Uncia, then turned coach. And I think officially his role is performance coach, if I read that correctly in the press release. While John, the former strategical coach of Valiant, I believe, or he might be the strategical coach now, they have some history in Overwatch, have been coaching for a while, so there's certainly some experience going into it. Overall, you would probably have to say this is just by the names, an average coaching staff that has huge potential based on what a Moneyball approach could bring and based on the sort of added veteran status of all of these but Baroy in terms of actually being on teams. Okay, so now we get to a little bit more speculative part, and we're going to talk about players who at this point are not at all announced, but they have been leaked, and I believe the leak source was Michael, if I'm being correct, or it might have been a leak source by the Korean scene, but yeah, this is basically from the rumored thread of the Overwatch League 2019, and it's a thread by Seagull #1 fanboy if you want to look it up on our competitive Overwatch. And basically the list of players is YakPong, Envy, Ivy, Stellar, Asher, Neko, and Aid. This is as far as we know right now. And we know that Overwatch League teams need 8 players, so we are missing one name here. So keep that in mind when evaluating that roster. So let's go from best to worst, shall we? So I don't know about best or worst in this case, but to me, Aid, formerly Rox Orcas and GGEA, I actually don't have much things to say to him. Of course, it's always hard to judge main supports based on the fact that a lot of their value comes from their intangibility, or their intangibles rather. So yeah, it's actually quite hard to say how impactful he will be in the team. From the stats I was looking at, well, they weren't really saying much at all. And one thing I guess that can be noted here is that he's already 24 years old. And that might be a significant part of the inner team hierarchy, because of course Koreans consider older people of respect, and with age comes a certain authority over your younger peers. So keep that in mind when building this roster. I believe he is the second player who's already 24. The other is Asher, yes. Okay, so the next one on the list would be Stella, of course, formerly of O2 Ardent. By the way, that is a theme in this team. 3 players are formerly of O2 Ardent. Of course, the team that got to the finals sort of in an upset win over Element Mystic in Contenders Korea Season 1, but then had a not so convincing performance in Contenders Season 2. One has to probably say that they did overperform based on results in Contenders Season 1, but it's still notable as an achievement. And so let's talk about Stella as a player. He seems to have a solid hit scan hero pool, especially these sort of annoying types as in Sombra and Tracer. He doesn't seem to be a particularly aggressive player, more like pretty passive, and generally, I guess if he has the decision to make between getting a trade kill or getting out and getting another opportunity, even though empirically both of those could lead to success, he will probably take the safer option most of the time. It's also reflected in his contender stats. So in that regard, keep in mind, I would classify him as a passive player, which will be important later on in this video. The next one is, as I already said, Asher. an older player, formerly of the LA Gladiators, one of the veterans of this team, obviously has played Overwatch Season 1. And Asher, for me, was one of the most improved players of Overwatch League Season 1, simply because his baseline of what we could expect or did see from him, especially in in Apex Season 3, was really bad. You could argue, just based on stats, he was actually the worst DPS playing in in Apex Season 3, and then climbed up and later on became a sort of serviceable tracer for a while, until Shofu was just undeniable as a second DPS in that position, and Hydration, of course, played a different role, so not much space anymore for Asher. And I still think that he's fairly serviceable, sort of also not the most aggressive player, so they have a pretty passive DPS tracer, as in hit scan line in that regard. Now, okay, so we had Stellar, Asher, and Aid. Who else? Okay, so let's talk about YakPong then. YakPong is formerly of O2 Blast, then switched to O2 Ardent, and is one of the younger players on the team. He will only turn 18, I think, sometime before the Overwatch League starts. And he is certainly question mark on this team, but he looks to have at least some potential. So his Winston was actually pretty solid, and if I recall correctly, his stats were also pretty good on Winston at least, and we didn't see much else from him. If I was to describe his playstyle though, it is really aggressive. So we're talking almost a Fissure-esque style, in which he might get a lot of resources, and this again once again would make sense if you have passive DPS players, that you would have the DPS players pulling more back and the tank players being sort of more like the playmakers and taking the engagements, also target calling and whatnot. So that seems to be the idea here. I think I might have spotted a pattern here, because one thing I talked to with Baroy, and I also elaborated on that in the Winston's Lab video. If you haven't seen it, go look it up on this channel. Is that Baroy found out that, generally speaking, teams with higher PTK shares, meaning percentage of kills, so the percentage of total kills a player gets from his team, if the PTK share on the tanks and supports is relatively higher than other teams, than those teams with high PTK shares on their DPS, that simply means that they are more likely to be a championship winning team and also place highly. So what that means is basically through all the contenders and Apex season, almost exclusively the top teams, with few exceptions such as KDP during the Rascal and Birdring era, were carried by, in terms, if you want to say high PTK share is carrying, we could argue the language there, by their tank lines. Of course, Lunatic High comes to mind, and there also the support line, of course, carried in that regard. Well, GC Busan also was sort of not exactly like that, but there is some GC Busan aspect later on in here that I want to also talk about. So YakPong, sort of a question mark. I personally could see him have potential. Then next up, Envy, of course, formerly of Valiant. And if I recall correctly, he had been let go because of inter-team differences, and then joined Metabellum. While he was playing on Valiant, a lot of Overwatch League players were saying that Envy was one of the best divas in the league, and it was actually really annoying to play against him. Now, what is very interesting about Envy's development as a player is that in the Overwatch League, he played extremely aggressive. And you could argue, and I had this conversation, for instance, just now before recording of this video with Benchmob, that he noticed, or he thinks, that Fate and Envy were actually the best dive frontline in the league in Stage 1. And I tend to agree with that. Their improvement also during the time, because if you remember back to Contender Season 0, they were actually really not that good, but came into the Overwatch League and had a tremendous improvement and suddenly were monsters. We certainly also thought of Fate and Envy as these monsters. So with Envy coming in, you got a player that has Overwatch League experience. You got a player that might have some behavioral issues, and you hope that you can brush that over. But you also have a player who can play very aggressively, and we also have to make the caveat here. He also didn't play well passively in Contenders. So on Metabellum, he had to play much more passively than he did on the Valiant, and he wasn't looking that in tune with that playstyle, which is furthermore towards my point that I believe this team wants to be aggressive based on the type of framework I have in mind, or I believe that Broy believes, I guess. And that then obviously also is adopted by the rest of the coaching staff. Thing about Envy was, honestly, his gravitons in Contenders were really not that convincing. It almost felt like he was unaware of the fight state, so he would throw out gravitons when they really weren't dragging out any ultimates from the opponent team, or really weren't going to win fights. It was often just a waste. That might also be a communication issue, of course, by the rest of the team. We will find out about this, but I think Envy as an aggressive off-tank has a lot of potential that he might come back to the top in that regard. And also, we would probably need a meta for this to be relevant. Okay. This will surprise some, because I said I would go from best to worst player. Well, the second best player on this team, to me, is Neko. Now, it might not be surprising that I think that Neko is this good. This is probably surprising that I think Ivy is better, but we'll come to that. So, Neko, of course, currently still officially with the Boston Uprising. Once again, we don't know what is going to happen in that regard. And while he was playing for the Uprising and was the starter for them, he was not only one of the most underrated players, he also had pretty good PTK share and was one of the engines fueling Boston in that part of the season. But he also was probably a top 3 flex support, which would go Jonak, Bedosin, Neko. That was my personal top 3, which I've mentioned many times before in the past. He is a very good Zen. He has a, if I remember correctly, a solid, if not good, Ana. And his playstyle, well, I would describe it as sort of balanced, but at times he can go for a play. And that, once again, would sort of fit into that PTK share. Supports should carry while the DPS sort of facilitate the rest of the game, but don't necessarily frag as much. The last player is, or that we know of, or that we don't even know, but speculate is going to be on the team, is Ivy. Now, I've heard a lot of good stuff about Ivy, and also rewatching some of the O2 games, I have to say, this guy might really be the real deal. So he has a very good Genji, Pharah, and Junkrat. Well, you will say, of course, he is their projectile player. He better have that. Yes. But he also has a Sombra and a Tracer. And he's super flexible in that regard and might just be the tool that you need in order to sort of make this team meta immune in some sense. Well, I think that this team still wants maybe one aggressive DPS, and I'm sure Ivy can play this on some heroes, because this is also one thing to keep in mind that was, for instance, way back when very crazy about Tivik is Tivik could play a lot of heroes, but he could also, within the hero, switch up his playstyle depending on what the situation required. And to this day, not many players know how to play what in which composition. They have one style of playing Junkrat, Pharah, and they will do this because it's practiced as such. They don't have a feeling for what kind of modes you may have and what the situation requires. That Ivy excels at. I will actually say a very good analyst, a friend of mine, you can check him out, Dreamcasts OW on Twitter, thinks that this might be the best talent that came out of Contenders this season, in terms of Contenders Korea and possibly the entire world. He thinks that this kid is absolutely nuts. And I tend to agree. Honestly, this looks to be, to me, a worthwhile gift from the gods, because we were sort of promised the coming of Flower, and we still don't know where he is, but Ivy might slot right into that demand of like a young god coming in, and I think he could be the crown jewel of the Toronto Defiant. If they can develop this player and sort of have him flex around the team and facilitate those tanks and these supports, then I think they have a working formula that is based on empirical evidence, or at least that is how I think this team conceives of their strategy. The thing is, I'm probably describing this here in way too simplistic terms. I'm sure they have a more complex understanding of Overwatch than I'm able to communicate here, or I probably have, and they probably have some more complexity behind it. But as a rough outline, I think they're possibly very good front line, they're sort of aggressive backline, they're rather passive hit scan DPS, but they are very flexible flex DPS. Makes it so that not only with their innate abilities, but also with the mix of experience and sort of at least rookie Overwatch League players, that it is an interesting concoction of talent that might very well go far. And I also put that together with the coaching staff that they have, and I think they might have what could be either, let's say, a regular season 10th to 8th team in the worst of cases, and then they could definitely also slot into the playoffs at 6th place, maybe directly qualifying, or actually getting into the Overwatch League based on one of those play-in tournaments. We will see how this turns out. Again, this is highly speculative because we don't even have a single player announced at this point. But I hope you enjoyed the exercise as much as I did. Thanks for watching.